Welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 33. My guest in this episode is Dr. James Cooke, neuroscientist, and he received his PhD in neuroscience from Oxford University. And in this conversation, I speak with Dr. Cooke about his living mirrors theory of consciousness. We also discuss plant medicine and psychedelic assisted therapy. And then we go on to tackle issues like meaning and purpose and spirituality. So I very much enjoyed this conversation with James, and I'm sure you will too. And I thank you for joining and sort of essentially passively participating by viewing the conversation. But I do hope you have a good takeaway from this, as did I. So thank you again and enjoy. I'd like to welcome Dr. James Cooke to the IdeaCast interview series. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you today, James, because I've been following your work for probably a year and a half to 2 years, and I probably found you through somebody else that I admire and follow. And so I came to appreciate what it is you do and some of the amazing guests that you've had on. So it's an honor to have you on board. And as we said before we hit record, I'm going to be able to interview an interviewer. And so that's, I think, a unique experience. So welcome, James. Glad to have you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad to be here, Justin.
Yes, absolutely. So, and for the audience, before we begin, I suspect that most of my audience who are subscribed to my channel know of Dr. Cooke's work, but I will have links down below and means to access his website as well as his social media. So I encourage you, if you are not subscribed to any of his, especially YouTube, that you do that, because if you like anything that goes on this channel, you're really going to like what James does with his. So let's go right ahead and get into some heavy thoughts here. And if you would, about a year and a half ago, you came out with the living mirrors theory of consciousness. And if we could start with that, and then we'll move our way up into more social and cultural ideas. But let's start with the ground floor and talk about consciousness.
Yeah, that sounds great. So the idea kind of came to me I was kind of thinking through my picture of the universe. And this was at a time when I was interested in kind of consciousness and from an interior sense, and then also science, looking at the brain. But I think I'd kind of assumed that this was a very difficult problem that it were not really anywhere near solving, and I wasn't really looking to solve that. And I happened to be thinking about my kind of how I would describe my understanding of the evolution of the universe, and I was thinking, through the kind of conventional scientific picture, and I got to the point where life comes into existence, and I just had this it was kind of like a visual seeing, a kind of imaginative recognition that when life comes into existence, I knew from the kind of physics of life that it forms a kind of three-dimensional structure, and it needs to resist the second law of thermodynamics. It doesn't violate it, but it needs to try to keep itself together in a world that's moving towards disorder. And I had this intuition that, in order to do that, it has to kind of reach out in a kind of non-material way, you could say, like informationally or with models, however you want to put it. There needs to be this process as it's relating to the world beyond its boundary, of believing things about the world, believing that this thing out there is harmful to me, or that thing is going to be good to eat, or none of these things are intrinsically in themselves. Harm isn't something that physicists have to account for. Harm, or I should say, the experience of pain, for example, isn't accounted for by physics. It's something that occurs in this relationship between the organism and the environment. And it kind of clicked to me. I was like, I think that's the moment. I think that's the moment. It's in this geometric process of relating from the organism to the environment, this embodied living, this process. It involves what we call consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so then I kind of looked at the literature and kind of physics of life and fleshed it out, wrote this paper. But that's the basic idea, is that to be a conscious system is to be an embodied living system. It happens at the level of the whole organism. And now, there are interesting questions then. Well, why does the brain seem to be so correlated with consciousness? And the way I think of that isn't that, the kind of naive way to think is that the brain produces consciousness like some kind of gas, which is kind of the most simplified way you could probably think about it. But instead, in this picture, you have consciousness is just the embodied living of the organism. And in systems with brains, it's a kind of, the brain isn't producing consciousness, it's a part in the loop from the environment through the organism as it engages in survival behavior. So there can be correlations in the body, and the brain's part of the body, but it doesn't mean that it's causing it. It doesn't mean that it's necessary for it or sufficient. And if you just have a brain in a jar, that it'll be conscious. It doesn't mean that living systems without nervous systems can't be conscious. So that's the kind of the fundamental idea.
Okay, so it's a form of biopsychism. Would that be a fair label to not?
Yeah. So Ernst Haeckel came up with this term biopsychism to basically say all living systems are conscious, which is what I'm claiming. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And I know this is somewhat evolutionary in its nature, I think. So it is a means to an operating system. Would that be another fair way to maybe take one aspect or perspective of what you're talking about? It's this process that, again, interacts with what we call out there, what we call physical reality, as we are learning to not be harmed or to preserve or to seek nourishment. It's a interactive means, I guess. Is that?
Yeah. So
getting any justice?
In the interaction, I would say there's like a kind of this analogy of a user interface. That we experience. Again, I think pain is quite an informative example, because if something is if you know something's going to hurt you, or you believe it's going to hurt you, you want to avoid it. That's the kind of essence of pain, is evasion. If you took a kind of phenomenological approach and you were thinking like, okay, what are all the different things that cause me pain, and what's the core essence of pain? It's that you don't want it to happen to you. Basically, is this very embodied thing to do with navigating the world. I don't want to move towards things that cause me pain. Fundamentally, of course, there are in sophisticated creatures like us, there is kind of sadism and levels of recursive processing that can probably violate that. But if we're thinking about the absolute basics of what pain is, for an amoeba, that's fundamentally what it is, right? I don't think you get sadistic amoebas, as far as I know. They wouldn't survive very long.
Which brings me to what I would be curious to know is this scalable? You mentioned that more sophisticated thinking creatures like ourselves, sentient creatures like ourselves, can cause our own suffering. We can sort of bypass that pro-adaptive nature of what you're describing here. So and especially in humans, I think it was about, I don't know, when there was a great series on University of California television on YouTube, and they talk about that moment when humans had this. It was the R-gap 11A to 11B conversion, and 450,000 years later, we had this big cortical mass in our heads, and that gave us rise to sort of self-reflective thinking. So is I guess part one of the question is consciousness scalable in that sense, that lesser organisms have their limits and how they can utilize that process of consciousness. And then when we get to sort of our level and like primates and cetaceans and things like that, especially us, again, with that big, mushrooming of the front cortex, does that cause a greater access? I don't know what the right word would be, access or utilization of what you're describing.
Yeah. So the way I think about it is, if you think about what it means to be a multicellular organism, we have this same bounded structure at our large scale. My skin, and I maintain that boundary, but I'm also made up of these smaller kind of bubbles, these smaller cells, and there are intermediate scales as well. So I think each of those scales adheres to this principle. It's kind of like a fractal picture where the smaller things have exactly the same. They have a full-blown consciousness at their level, and I have a full-blown consciousness at the whole organism level. So when we introspect, I think, when things that we think of as unconscious that then arise into conscious, I see that as kind of almost a signaling between these two different spheres of different processes. So if you might have a system that if I could be my cerebellum that is taking control of my arms when I'm riding a bike, or my legs, I should say. I was going to use tennis as an analogy then, so I mixed my analogies.
You're holding a tennis racket while riding your bike.
Exactly, and I'm pushing the pedals with my arms, apparently. If I could be, we think of that as an unconscious process, but if I could feel what it's like to be my cerebellum in the same way, if I could, the thought experiment, if I could feel what it's like to be you, I'm saying there would still be an experience there. We tend to think that kind of reptiles with the non-cortical parts of the brain that a lot of people speculate they're unconscious, they don't, have an experience because we don't know what it's like to be our superior colliculus or the visual processing areas that feel like from the perspective of ego James, who's living in my cortex. Don't take that too literally, but who's associated with those systems, doesn't usually have access to those things. But if another system like my hippocampus can kind of send out signals to that part of the brain, then in the same way that I can perceive the meaning behind your speech, I think the kind of the sphere that we think of as this sphere that I James am experiencing, the part that's associated with language centers, and I think it can perceive those other brain systems. So I think there's this kind of almost like a hall of mirrors where we don't see this is what's going on. We're looking in one reflection, we're looking in one mirror surface, but there's all of this stuff going on. And it seems kind of confusing when you introspect. Okay, some of it goes out of view, but I don't know why. It's gone unconscious. Sometimes it comes into consciousness. And I'm saying if you could see that it's actually all of these different systems kind of aligning and then misaligning and communicating with each other, I think that's the picture. And we're fundamentally, you're talking to the language center part right now, the sphere of influence that has that ability to introspect, and those are the kind of the bits of the brain that do the science as well, that we all get together and we talk to each other and do the philosophy. But I guess I'm saying, when you think of us evolutionarily as a kind of the loose analogy of a kind of reptilian brain and a mammalian brain, if you think of those areas, I think of it as almost like we are kind of multiple creatures stitched on top of each other. We really do have systems that might be semi-independent, have their own experience that is what it's like to be a reptile, roughly. And then and riding on top of that is this kind of mammalian experience as well. But those more basic systems are getting on fine, making my heart beat and doing all the other stuff, whilst this other system, unbeknownst to it, having these kind of parallel lives. But I think this is something where it might preempt a bit, talk of spirituality. But if you've had an experience of sitting with consciousness and feeling it just as raw experience, I think this is more likely to seem plausible to you, because if you're living in thought and you're just thinking all the time, then you're inclined to think that's what the mind is like. It consists of you getting up and going, okay, I've got to get my coffee. What am I going to do now? I've got to solve some problems. And that's what it is to be a creature with a mind. Whereas actually for most of life on Earth, and for us, if we slow down and pay attention, consciousness is about feeling. It's about this kind of, in the present moment, wordlessly navigating the world. So when you feel consciousness to be like that, I have no problem, thinking that a single cell, could feel a certain way to be resisting dissolving into its environment. It just has this basic kind of, you might think of it as a kind of gut instinct of disliking, if you dump loads of salt on it and it's going to burst, it might have this sensation of, as synonymous with the process of it retreating away from that salt gradient into a safe area. From the inside, that feels like an experience of disliking the situation. And for me, I feel like, I think drawing the boundary between the conscious and the non-conscious, between living systems and non-living systems, makes a lot more sense to me than drawing it anywhere from the origin of life to now. Because if you speculate that there are living systems that don't have conscious experiences, then you get these kind of insoluble problems. I kind of think the hard problem of consciousness, the idea that that any system that can have a conscious experience could function the same way without a conscious experience, I think that's only possible to conceive because we've convinced ourselves that such a thing exists, that it's possible to be an automaton. You have Descartes torturing animals because he thought they have no interior world and they're truly robots. And then you get into this philosophical problem of like, well, if that's a robot with no experience and I'm a robot with an experience, what's this magic extra thing? But if instead you say, well, I'm a living embodied organism that feels its way through the world, and this is what it's like to be a living embodied organism, then that problem kind of disappears.
Okay. Now, in my understanding of your presentation of your system, it is, you say that consciousness emerges or is derivative of physical, no, we have to be. I have to be careful saying materiality because we're going to hang a huge asterisk over that, and you can explain that. But the stuff of substance, let's say the objects of the world or the objects that form what we consider to be the subject. So you and I are just hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, swirling, mostly carbon, but we're swirling about all these little particles. So can you explain how you present that consciousness is a part of that matrix?
Right. Yeah. So the issue of emergence is, what I am saying is that before life existed, the lights were off in the universe. Stars were not feeling anything. There is no universal consciousness that was experiencing things before life. And so in that sense, I'm saying when life exists, something new has emerged, right? There's a genuinely new phenomenon. But at the same time, I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying like a new substance has come into existence or something has come into existence. It's a process, So in a sense, I'm also saying that consciousness as it exists now is not reducible. We can come up with I'm offering a kind of a humble scientific story. This is not supposed to be a kind of a watertight philosophical proof that has just solved the problem. It's saying in the same way that when someone tells me, the way that different molecules in water bind together at different temperatures accounts for why it flows. The loose bonds account for why it flows when it's warm, and then the strong bonds why it's ice when it's and solid when it's cold. That to me, I'm like, okay, I get it. I have no more questions, no further questions around why water flows and why it doesn't. In the same way, for me, this feeling of, okay, well, the way the living systems have to relate to their environment. If you say, is a rock conscious, is my glass conscious, is an animal conscious, I now can tell a story that I find compelling. I would say like, okay, well, that's the story. And then it's scientific in the sense that then we have to chase up and say, well, does this make sense? Like, then why does brain activity correlate to consciousness? I tried to give my account of that earlier. And does the kind of processing that underlies what I'm talking about, this kind of Bayesian inference process, does consciousness, if we do the neuroscience of consciousness, does it fit in with that story? And it's looking like it does. There's a lot of work now on kind of Bayesian predictive processing in the brain, and people like Anil Seth, and it really is converging. It seems, it seems to be based in this kind of process. Yes, have I answered your question? Sorry, I may have gone off topic there.
No, you did, and part of, so I'll say two things. First of all, to the audience, that Dr. Cooke is not a physicalist per se, and so he can explain that. But the other thing that I found elegant about what you propose is that if it is emergent, that it's a relational emergence. And this will kind of get the cat out of the bag as far as your take on physical things, in that it reduces down into essentially abstraction, so that we cannot truly define. It's not marbles all the way down or billiard balls all the way down. It's not grains of sand all the way down. It eventually goes down to this sort of quantum field, or whatever you want to describe it. And I'll let you do your take on that, because I don't want to put words in your mouth. But my take on this is that if materiality, as we call it, is not essentially material, that the consciousness that may come along for the ride when it comes to organizing and living systems, again, may be relational in that sense. So why don't you, if you could, just give your take on your view rather on physicality or physical systems and reductionism and things like that.
So the issue of reductionism in the previous point is that the whilst you can tell a nice story as to which systems are conscious, to be conscious to this experience now, the story doesn't explain it away. It doesn't reduce it to matter. It's a genuinely new phenomenon. So so you have to take a kind of dual aspect approach as well, where you say, I can't explain away what it feels like from the inside to be a living system with a third person description. Those are two different descriptions, and there will always be two different descriptions. And I'm okay with that. I don't think science has to only be, when I say science, I mean the kind of the broad quest to understand what's going on. I don't think that has to be confined to just third person descriptions in some dogmatic way. I think we can have these different perspectives. So then the issue of kind of physicality. So it's, if we go right back to saying, why is there something rather than nothing? to get at what is this thing that's happening right now, this experience of existence. If I start with my own experience, I kind of can verify in my own experience something that's been attested to in lots of different kind of wisdom traditions, which is that when you look at your own experience, you can't find a solid thing there. You can't find a self, something that kind of exists over time. And when you interrogate any particular experience, it's kind of empty of any real essence. So this kind of leads to what I was saying before, that we think of kind of pain qualia, which is almost like an atom of experience. But actually, when you look at pain, it really is nothing but this relational, significance for the organism. So you look inside, and what you find is there's a kind of a nothingness and an intangible quality. But at the same time, this is happening. We exist. Like it's a kind of special nothingness that births everything. And so this can be a description of your inner experience. But I also think this is how I think about kind of why anything is happening at all. So, if you think of why is there something rather than nothing? Well, if there's something, then great, problem solved. No need to explain. The difficult thing is to explain why isn't there nothing, right? So if there was nothing, what would the nature of that nothing be? Well, there couldn't kind of constraints couldn't exist, boundaries couldn't exist, rules couldn't exist. So it would have to be a kind of boundless, infinite potentiality, really. It would have to be a kind of a void that then kind of runs through all the permutations of what is possible. Maybe very little is possible, but eventually, if we're going to use a time analogy, that would happen because there's no constraints. So this is very kind of speculative, but to me, that kind of scratches the itch of saying, well, why is there something rather than nothing? And it fits with this internal experience of like what seems to be going on in my experience of the world is this creative, potent void that's kind of, I think it's very naturalistic when I say creative. It's not teleological and driving. It's just everything's just kind of running through the permutations. It's almost like a kind of computational, some people have this, I think Max Tegmark might have spoken about this, the idea of the universe as a kind of computer just kind of running through all the different possible things. It's kind of like that. So then what do you have? You have a process that's happening, and there's patterns in the process. And then we come along and, we experience the world, and I say, okay, the table's in front of me, I can measure it, you can measure it, I can come back a later time and measure it, and there's consistency there. And then we get into this idea of matter, right? We say there's something third-person, objective, measurable, quantifiable out there. But that's a mapping process. So this issue of things being made of matter, I think substances, I think thinking in terms of substances is a very parochial human kind of local thing where like I build a little castle out of Lego and you say, what's that castle made of? And I say, it's made of Lego in the sense that it has this relationship to smaller things. But if we take that useful little module for navigating the world, and then we say, well, what are atoms made of? And what are subatomic particles made of? And the fabric of reality has to be made of little building blocks. Then you're just applying your kind of, local little module that's useful for navigating the world to the fabric of reality, which I think is this process. It's a unitive, interdependent relational process. And yeah, I think you can feel that in your experience as well. So then to one person, they might say to be a materialist when we're talking about consciousness, what they really care about is whether you think it's emergent. Some people really say, if you don't think there's the mind of God, the kind of the kind of idealism picture of some single consciousness that is existence, if you don't think that, then you're a materialist. And in that, the way people use it that way, then I am, because I think that this process that we call matter is more fundamental, you could say, than consciousness, because it can exist and then consciousness can come into existence. But at the same time, I'm clearly not, there's a version of materialism that's like the Richard Dawkins type of there's no value at all to be found in the world's wisdom traditions, and just get on with, the project of human egoic kind of filling our needs. I'm clearly not that kind of materialist. And so, the final thing I'd say is that, so for me, when people talk about spiritual experience, we look inside and we discover ourselves to be the same thing as the rest of the universe. That what we are is, we're truly at home in the world. We're grounded in the universe. We are the universe. But then we have to we are bounded by our own phenomenal experience. And so there's a bit of work you have to do to say, well, what aspects of me is the same thing as the universe? And that's what I think thinking about science and doing philosophy and seeing where things are consistent really helps. And the conclusion to me is that this process, this unfolding, the potent void, whatever you want to call it, is the same thing that I think science describes, and that is what I feel myself to be in my nature. But then you also can experience consciousness as part of yourself, and there's even, when you kind of get still enough, there can be a sense of benevolence and love. And so people, when they take those two, I think there's a projection process that's it's appealing to say the universe is that. The universe is this consciousness, this loving God consciousness. And I think that comes out of a kind of, it's just a kind of quite reassuring on a basic level, in a kind of like, to the infant in us that likes the idea of a kind of all-powerful parent who loves us and is looking after us, and death doesn't matter because we'll just go back to that thing. I not to be offensive to people who hold this view, but I think it just comes out of that basic instinct, and so for me, I'm okay with that. I think it doesn't mean that we're not the same thing as the universe. It doesn't mean that we're not at home in the universe just because the lights come on and off when living systems come into existence. Yeah.
Sure. And you're in good company, because I reject theism myself. I don't believe in transcendent sky parents or anything like that. And I think that's safe as a starting point. We can hold our own personal beliefs as much as we want, but I think given observation, it's more prudent to step back and be a little more conservative about what's really going on. So with regard to an ontological primitive, would you claim yourself to be an agnostic? I know you say that there's a unitary nature to the universe that is a physical universe, but then again, the physical is X, right? Or maybe an unknown. It can't be defined. It's untenable in terms of definition. So where would you place yourself in an ontological position?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say it's basically a process ontology. So I mean, that's probably the most satisfying answer I can give, because I generally see the task of the human mind trying to come up with a story as to what reality is, in terms of, I tend to think that's the thing I was saying before about substance and saying like, what's it made of? And I think that's a kind of ends up being a fool's errand. Again, well, you can rephrase the important parts of the same question, come down to emergence. I would say, does what we call matter exist before mind, and then mind emerges in the way I'm arguing? Does mind exist first, and then what we call matter is a way of looking at mind? And in that case, you could say that one's a materialist and one's an idealist. So in that sense, you can use these terms. But again, I feel more comfortable talking about, I think everything is relations. So if you're talking about how does this relate to that, which one comes first, which one's more fundamental, I feel more comfortable there than saying, what is it? And as you kind of alluded to, if you say it's X, you're at that point, language is relational. Language is about comparing things. So if you're saying it is X, X means nothing really, I think, if you just say that statement by itself.
Would consciousness have a place in sort of a neutral monism scheme? So if we were to say that, again, there's this underlying unknown that we can just not even pretend to speculate on, or try to come up with good answers through speculation, and there is materiality, and then there is that which is consciousness that comes in when materiality organizes itself in a certain configuration or a certain system like ourselves. Do you think it has that level of importance that it needs to be incorporated into a scheme, a metaphysical scheme?
Consciousness. Yeah, that's a good question. So my bias is, coming from being a scientist, is this kind of view of consciousness as not necessary, really. The universe could unfold in a way, and we see it unfolding in vast swathes of the universe where there's no life. And again, assuming that panpsychism or idealism isn't true. And so that's the kind of view I've always had, that the standard scientific view that we're something peripheral happening. At the same time, we are at the leading edge of the unfolding of the universe. We're clearly part of this. We're clearly natural. We're clearly, it's entirely normal and natural what's happening in our existing. So I wouldn't say that we're a fluke, that we're kind of, not at home in the universe. But this is something that I'm thinking a lot more about now, because know people who feel very much like our universe is fertile, and basically, I mean, you see new stuff coming out all the time about, the precursors to life, these long chemicals that exist on asteroids and things, and just we used to think, okay, it's only here and this miracle happened, and actually, it seems more and more like the universe is quite fertile. So that's something I'm trying to wrestle with more, is to think, is mind and life something, am I buying into a story that actually before we came along it was all dead stuff that has no significance and is absolutely nothing like us? Or is there something in the unfolding of the universe that is a bit more like we are? And again, my bias is always, I think my bias is in the direction of not going that direction, of thinking that mind has to exist or it's essential. But I'm open to it. I think it seems less. Again, I used to think of it as a kind of, again, another kind of comforting, something people are incentivized to think about, because it makes us feel more at home in the universe if we say, oh, like, we're what it's about, right? Like human experience is what it's, especially if they think human development is significant. I tend to, I mean, especially when you look at the kind of absurdism of the level of suffering in the animal kingdom, and I don't see a kind of a teleological benevolent picture where mind has to come into existence. But I'm open to the idea that, I might be not doing it justice by thinking that we're not really, it's not kind of almost necessary that we be birthed out of a fertile universe at some point.
Right. I like to invert teleology, and I like to think that, as you said, we are kind of at the spearhead of an evolving universe, or an unfolding universe, or a computational system that is discovering itself, which could put implications there that we don't want, but for lack of better words. And so I like to think of us as telos generators. And, why look, it's same thing with meaning, like why look outward for meaning? Meaning, we have that faculty to process and make meaning, and we can make purpose, and we'll get to things like that towards the second part of our conversation. But yeah, I think we can look to within ourselves for those things that we tend to maybe see or impose, or project out, out of ourselves onto the universe. And so I take an agnostic position as far as, whether there is any sort of drive to create, and that could be, so again, if you talk about idealists, you could you make a few semantic moves, and it may not be consciousness. It may just be, as you said, this system unfolding, and it's working out algorithms, but it's not doing that consciously. It's just by natural process. But then in its own right, that may be, as you said, there is the potential for fertility. There are things that could form amino acids that are sitting in slushy comets and things like that. And I think that's what they figured our abiogenesis started, was this big snowball hit the earth, and it had just the right ingredients to start forming proteins and stuff of life, amino acids and things like, what am I, peptides or whatever, whatever it was that was necessary. So let's go forward a little bit.
And just on that point, yes. Just to put a point on it, I think to me the universe is like an exhalation rather than inhalation. It feels like things are releasing and flowing downhill to find the natural place in a kind of lawful way, which is why that's different to a teleological picture. I think is more goal directed, where it's when you're exhaling, it's a release. You're not. I could see why some people would say, oh, it looks like it's trying to get to disorder, or it's trying to release, but that's not what it feels like to release or to exhale. Whereas, if the universe was cranking things up in a certain direction, that is what teleology would look like to me.
Okay. I have this, I don't know if you'd appreciate this question, but I have this informal thought in my head that when you mentioned the second law of thermodynamics, that we are these very ephemeral, and this is a bad word, and real scientists would cringe when they hear it, but like negentropic or negative entropy systems that seem to just ephemerally arise. And then, of course, we die after 80 or 90 years and collapse back into our prime constituents. That just fascinates me, that is a plausible system within this universe, that life is sort of counter to, it's very temporary, and it won't go anywhere, because Google years from now, this whole thing's probably going to just,
Yeah.
just cool off and not be anymore. But that's always fascinating. Maybe it's a stoner thought of mine or something. It's just
No.
we are these and I don't smoke pot anymore, but that you probably categorize that. But just the fact that we can arise out of this and be animated and have this conversation is quite fascinating. So, to invoke anything supernatural is, to me, is unnecessary, because this is so incredibly supernatural in a sense.
Yeah, and I think, again, I often think of the supernatural instinct as coming from a kind of a need to self-soothe in some way, where the reason, part of the reason I'm kind of, I guess, allied to naturalism is, again, this absurdism where you see the kind of the level of suffering in the world, and that it just things that there's no rhyme or reason to it. When children die of disease and things like that, there's no great benevolence there. It's just happening. Things are just unfolding lawfully, and there's cause and effect. And so if you want to say spirituality, is basically, it's quite a it's quite a stern spirituality, I guess, where it's saying what you can discover is that you don't have to live on the level of the human mind. The parts of us that have evolved to basically be freaked out by everything that's going on, and stress, and we all live there a lot of the time, but it's possible to release that, and the lights don't go out. You can still just be aware, and you can just be. And then to know that you can toggle between those it gives you all the things you want out of spirituality. It gives you a sense of being connected in a home in the universe. It gives you a sense of liberation from suffering. And that's what I, if I was signing up for a spirituality, that's the stuff I would want. I don't, to then want the kind of there needs to be, as you say, a sky parent or an abstracted version of that is a loving consciousness that everything goes back into, and it's this eternal, loving. It's to me, I don't see a reason that just doesn't fit with what I, know about the universe. And I think it's most easily explained by this desire to soothe oneself instead of learning to let go of those kinds of needs. And so it's more of a kind of Buddhist non-attached view rather than something, and very more kind of lean and psychological rather than metaphysical.
Right. Well, I think that's a good place to start, and then be informed by that. And then if you do want to entertain other notions, that if you can maintain that relationship with having been informed by, again, a very basic structure of, because spirituality can become inflationary very quickly, or it can become nonsensical very quickly. So let's segue into spirituality from metaphysics. And could you do a thumbnail of you did essentially hit some points just now, but maybe do I guess the young people call it an elevator pitch or whatever of what you're talking about with spirituality, because I like your language, and I like to go with that for a little bit. So if you could.
Yeah. So I hit the main notes there of this began for me when I was, as a teenager, at a real kind of crisis point, thinking about Christian theology, stressing about the prospect of being sent to hell, and the fact that because I didn't have blind faith, and that there was nothing I could do. I couldn't will myself to have blind faith. I didn't have that power to transform myself. And this benevolent God had made me this way, but it was going to torture me forever, and I was just trapped, and this was coming on top. I now look back and know that there was a lot of emotional stress in my life, and so that as a way of processing it, that when it's it wasn't entirely about the theology, but it led to a point where I think like a Zen koan that's designed to baffle the rational mind. My problem solving just was stuck in this loop that I just described of there's literally no way to solve this, and I just got worked up until it just kind of screeched to a halt. And as I described, I found that the lights didn't go out. I was still wide awake, and more wide awake than I'd ever been in my life. The thinking had stopped, and everything was fine. Literally, everything. Is this deep sense of feeling everything existence is fine. It's okay. You don't, and this kind of goes to what I was saying before. It's a psychological process where it's realizing you don't have to do that. You don't have to sit here and put all this pressure on yourself and ruminate and all of that stuff. You can just be. And when you just exist, it's profound. You feel this sense of awe that you genuinely exist in this, flung into existence in this vast universe. You notice things like that there is no there is no, the thing that was you thought was doing the thinking isn't really there. There's just a world that you're part of, and again, all of this fits with science. And this is probably the thing that drives me forward most, is trying to convey that all of this good stuff about spiritual insight is real and it totally fits with science. And yeah, and so it's before, the way I teed it up before made it sound quite lean and bleak, but actually it's a as I said, I think subjectively it gives you all of the good stuff you could want out of spirituality. And I've always kind of struggled with the word spirituality because of connotations with supernatural thinking. But more recently, I've been sitting with the kind of the story I told earlier of my metaphysics of thinking about reality as a process. And when you feel yourself to be that process, that is tapping into that, realizing that is kind of what we're talking about. Well, the etymology of spirit is from the word breath, and similarly kind of wind. And my feeling is that what it was initially meant was kind of process. It's a sense of, through introspection, discovering this process, this unfolding of reality. And so in that sense, actually, if you take the word literally, then I think I'm very much kind of an advocate for spirituality, for discovering that you are the unfolding of nature. And I find a lot of affinity with things like Taoism that speak about living in wisely and kind of flow with the natural world. So yeah, I would say fundamentally I'm advocating for a naturalistic spirituality. And I think this fits nicely with science as well, because the kind of spirituality I'm arguing for and science are both based around really holding yourself accountable, not giving in to anything, any comforting stories that just feel, in the same way with science, you can't just believe something because it feels nice. You really have to have evidence for it. You have to make sure everything hangs together. I think that's the kind of spirituality we need, to hold ourselves accountable, not give in to kind of sloppy thinking and just believing things because they feel nice. And I see no reason why that shouldn't genuinely form a kind of centerpiece of our culture. I think we would live in a healthier culture if that were the case. And, having grown up in a kind of in Catholicism, I have a very kind of new atheist, anti-religion kind of, bent when it comes to institutionalized religion. But I do think there's a reason it's considered one of the kind of the pillars of society, if you want to say religion, but spirituality gives the sense of a decentralized thing where people are empowered to discover things for themselves. So yeah, I think you can make a case that maybe the root issue, one aspect of the root issue with society is a loss of realizing these states. Because for me, what they do is they give you a sense of deep grounding in existence. When you're in the mode of waking up in the morning and flitting from this to that, and if you've never done any of this kind of work, you're really not that grounded. If you were to try and make sense of what's going on, if you took the idea of if someone like that who just lived their whole life just going about their life, and suddenly they have a big psychedelic experience, they can be utterly kind of flabbergasted, but just through a confrontation with the present moment, they're just sitting here, they're looking at the natural world, and they're like, wait a minute, I was living in all these models, all these abstractions. Yeah. I was not connected to what's really going on. What's really going on is feeling in, existing as part of the natural world. And so that's what I'm talking about, as a process of really living on that level, connecting with that, so that when you take a high dose of a psychedelic, you're like, oh yeah, here I am. Like, I know this. Like, this is what's going on. It's the unfolding. I'm connected with everything. There is no separate self that really exists inside me, and feeling comfortable with that. And I think things come into alignment a lot more when you live that way, because the other way to live is with a kind of the psychological sense of a separate self, which is inherently slightly neurotic, slightly concerned with yourself more than others. And I don't think we should get rid of it completely, and I don't think we can. But I think part of what's wrong is we're lost. We're kind of cranking up the, as embodied living organisms, it's fear that tends to push us into this individualistic sense of a separate self. And so I think, and then when you have conflict and fear, you get into a kind of feedback loop. And so I think we live in a society that's kind of cranking us tighter and tighter into our separate selves. And that's a process that's not leading anywhere good, basically. So right. The antidote is to release and come back into feeling grounded.
I think
That's
one of
more
my
than an elevator pitch. That's quite a long, long
oh no
elevator,
no
right?
well, in the context of one of these interviews, it was an elevator pitch.
Yeah,
It was
it's a
pretty.
100-floor building or something.
That's right. Yeah, we're going up to the Burj Khalifa or something in Dubai. So yeah, for me, the one of my takeaways from Buddhism is as one of those sort of cliche tenets of Buddhism that attachment is suffering. And so what I do is I distill that a little bit and I say attachment to identity is suffering. Self identity can lead to suffering. And so there has to be this fluid spectral thing that we have to operate on. It's necessary sometimes to be fully invested in yourself and fully invested in selfishness.
Right.
But there's also times where you have to pull back, and I think that's, again, psychedelics and meditation are perfect for that. They give you that opportunity, and when you do experience that bliss of not being yourself for a while, you then become an advocate for this type of thinking. And I would also, to answer a couple of things you were saying in your elevator pitch, is that if someone's listening to this conversation and they are wedded to an idea of there being transcendence or there being divinity, which is fine. I can see that metaphorically. I can see that in language. But to really adhere to something that is of that nature, I would say, well, that which created you, that which brought you here, has you here playing by these rules, and you're playing by the rules of physics and three-dimensional existence and psychological existence, psychosocial existence, etc. And so don't question the nature of that which put you here. So in other words, there is the desire to reach back out, or the desire to escape, or the desire to, as some Abrahamic teachings or Abrahamic systems will say, well, just suffer through this world and you'll get your reward in the next world, and that's escapism, right? So I would implore someone to rethink that idea that if there is that, if we grant you that you're here and you exist, and these are the rules, and these are your co-inhabitants, and these are your structures that you interact with. So I would offer that to someone to help couple what you're saying, that this spirituality can be had in a very naturalistic sense, because essentially, and I'm not granting that for myself, but this is what we have, this is what we've got, this is what we can work with, and it should be incredibly profound, I think.
Yeah, and I think the sense of profundity, and you mentioned the word divinity. I think I'd be keen to emphasize that something like sacred, I'm comfortable with. I think where I would say that the experience of connecting with the world, I think nature, what I would call nature, someone else might call God, if they have a kind of a mystical vision of God as the unfolding of the universe. And the reason I say it is to say that I really think, existence exists, and then science is a map that overlays it. So and this is another thing why the word materialism is something I don't jump to, is because most materialists really are obsessed with the map. And if you talk about states of awe and stuff, it's like, well, they should be reducible to the map. I should be able to tell a story of brain states and what I've seen on the scanner that then makes your awe experience something that's actually not that interesting. And that's not a game I'm interested in playing. I say we genuinely exist. Awe is real. Meaning is real for us. As you said earlier, kind of exists within us. Purpose exists within us. The life process brings in kind of purposive states into existence. And in the sacred, I'm inclined to say, I've had this experience, a lot of just, sitting, connecting with the world, and it feels sacred. And that's really enough to say it is sacred, because to me, I guess what I mean by sacred is it's worthy of respect, worthy of awe. And now you could say, well, like, what do you mean? Like, the natural world isn't worthy of respect, and sure, you can live that way. That's the way we are living as a culture. And look where it gets you. It gets you to ecological destruction and climate change.
Commodifying.
So I would argue it's wise to be respectful to nature, but at the same time, it's a vivid. Maybe it's even evolved. I'm not sure really where it comes from, but it's a very vivid thing people feel again and again. It could also be a kind of geometric thing about. Or when it comes to just how small we are as part of a kind of larger reality, that could be where the awe component kind of comes in. But yeah, it's important to say that profundity and the sacred could be part of this vision as well, I think.
Sure. And I would be sympathetic and open to the idea of panentheism, in a sense that you could consider all that is, the pars pro toto, as being sacred, right? Because again, it is our life bringer. It is that which does, when we have our
Right.
moments of joy and bliss and all that. So I'm totally open to that. But again, it's more of a philosophical perspective than a
Yeah.
theologic
And
perspective.
if the word God hadn't gone from a kind of mystical one to the kind of authoritarian sky daddy image
Yeah.
that we have of God, I'd even be tempted to use that, because I take the word God to almost be I mean, if you think of what is that concept, surely if it means anything, it means the thing that is beyond everything else, beyond all other concepts. It's the kind of the ultimate. And I think of reality as fundamentally, it's not conceptual. It is not the map. It just is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel very comfortable saying reality is non-conceptual, because that clearly isn't a supernatural claim. That's just a statement about the relationship of maps to the territory of existence. But if I were living in a different time, I might say, yeah, like existence is God, by which I mean it's
Mm-hmm.
this awe-inspiring ultimate thing that is not the same as the stories we tell about it.
Yeah, I think the term God is a good placeholder for, again, the mystery or the X or whatever it is that we probably shouldn't try to define at this point. Because again, like my analogy with somebody wanting to go back to, home and dad and all that, it's not necessary as we exist right now. Let's just take that for granted, that it isn't necessary, and that we can, as social creatures, come together and find systems that honor and respect our place and what function we can devise for ourselves. And a lot of your work and the interviews that you do, you just did an interview on regenerative agriculture that just came out today, and I watched that before this interview, and it focuses on rethinking, commodification or the fetishization of material objects, and that sort of we might as well live good and die, because it's either a nihilist game, or dad's going to be pissed and I'm going to burn in hell forever. You don't have very good prospects. There's a very slim chance you'll go to paradise, some timeshare thing up there that's really neat. But a lot of the things seem stacked against us, because again, if you play the morality cards, it's tough to walk, and it's so, each preacher has a different thing for how you can go wrong and how you will get sent to that bad place. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that in your work, that you are looking for change makers, solution-oriented people who really have a good vision and the incentive by way of this kind of thinking, return to
Thank you.
empathetic thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see what I'm doing with those conversations. Just my work in general is kind of, it really does go back to that moment when I was a teenager, having my kind of this mystical experience where, in a second, just the experience of being grounded in the present moment, it's so simple. And that's, why even just paying attention to the breath in meditation is a powerful practice, because it takes you in that direction of being grounded in the present moment. But so much from that perspective can then be unpacked, and it makes sense. It reconfigures everything. And so the kinds of conversations I'm having and the kind of topics I explore, all what I'm trying to do is basically, from what I can read in from different spiritual traditions, people practicing different ways, there seem to be a set of common experiences or common aspects to this unit of experience. And so I guess what I'm trying to do is offer a map of the different issues at play and the way they look from this perspective to me. So other people, could just almost have a library of like, okay, here are the relevant, at least, as best job as I can do, here is what I think the relevant things are. And so again, you see ecological awareness, this has been shown scientifically now, increases after mystical experiences with psychedelics, and I think otherwise as well. And so that hence, thinking about regenerative agriculture, but also it fits with this. When you learn to live in the present moment, you realize that this fleeing into the future and this fear-based egoic sense of separation is kind of what's wrong with us. We're, our fantasies of going to Mars and we'll just keep growing and colonizing, and it will just, if we just keep running and thinking about tomorrow, we can problem solve our way out of this. But that's the mechanism of suffering, is the egoic kind of problem solving mode. And what we need to do is kind of unwind the tension and come back into a sense of healing. So all of this, my hope is that when people have these kinds of experiences for the first time, I'm very excited about psychedelic medicine being rolled out in the next few years, because I think again and again people will be having these experiences and thinking, of course, like it makes sense from this perspective. We're no longer lost. This is the thing I was saying before about being grounded in experience, grounded in nature. Because I think at the moment we're so heady as a culture. people can believe completely different things, and there's no grounding in reality that brings us into a consensus, brings us into a kind of shared worldview. And I think this being in the present moment, feeling connected to nature is such a, and when I say feeling connected to nature, I'm not just saying, go for a walk in the park. I mean the sense of deep feeling part of the universe, feeling of belonging to the universe. This is something I think we can all access, and that should hopefully bring us into some greater alignment. And then, there'll be, I think the way humans have lived before, it's not that, again, we all just dissolve into this oneness. There's a balancing act between being grounded in the present moment and then going out and doing things, trying to improve the world, trying to help each other, trying to look out for yourself. But then you're coming back into that sense of the unitive sense of being grounded. And people would have done that, in the past through shamanism, through ritual, through, ecstatic dance, all these different things. But we don't really have those now. And so I think it's an issue of imbalance. And so I can imagine human history unfolding in a wonderful way where a lot's happening, but we're in a perspective where, in addition to that, we always have this container that's bringing us back to feeling grounded. That's what I would like to see for the human race generally, not to sound, too grandiose, but I think that I genuinely think this is the issue that's at play.
Amen. So I'll ask you a couple of questions to get your insight on the way forward. And so, touching on what you were just saying, through a sort of psychedelic healing period or renaissance, or however you want to phrase that, I think about the structure of our society, and that the people who could benefit the most would probably be resistant to reaching out for assistance. So we think about dark vulnerable triad or narcissist personality disorder.
Right.
I don't even want to say disorder, but people laboring with these psychic presentations. So I think, would it be a case of folks who, in other words, the strength in numbers of people who can bring themselves to do the work, and then it becomes socially less fashionable to be in that mindset, and it's almost not that it's a conscious mindset, but that operational system of narcissism and so forth. I mean, how do we get through that kind of?
Yeah, so I think you've hit on really the issue. Like, when it comes to how do we transition to, if we could transition to this world, the resistance will come from those quarters, from the proportion of the population who are just cemented in their egos. Research from Keith Campbell, a psychologist, suggests that he had a study, I think, showing that psychedelics don't really seem to shift narcissism. Like, they can shift other things, but it doesn't seem to shift. And there's an extent to which we can be pushed into egoic narcissistic behavior through trauma. And so hopefully as healing progresses, that will become less of a critical mass of that kind of thing. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't, as I'm glad you're saying, even calling it narcissistic personality disorder in this kind of clinical way, we should think of it as not something to be gotten rid of. It's an aspect of the human mind that is real, and it's there for a reason. Sometimes you do really need to protect yourself and assert hard boundaries, and what it tends to be is just really overly hard boundaries and self-interest that leads to a kind of, often they feel trapped in a suffering long term as well. So you couldn't say there's a pathology there, or there's unnecessary excess suffering going on. But yeah, I think you see, like, I think it's the Kalahari Bushmen who have these. There was an anthropologist who lived with them, and they have this tradition of, when like a young hunter comes back with like a big kill, they'll just completely mock it and just say it's terrible, it's a bag of bones, like, why do you even bother? And the anthropologist, he gave them a gift, and they all just ripped him for it, just said it was terrible, why did you even bother bringing us? And he was genuinely hurt by it. And then he said to him, like, why were you so mean to me? And they basically explained, one of them explained, like, if a young hunter like does something great, then we don't want them getting ideas in their head that they're better than other people, that they should be in a position of power. And, so we do this as a way to kind of, bring them down a peg and make sure everything functions harmoniously. So it seems that people, this is not some pathology of the human mind. It's something that's always there that we have to manage. So this is kind of, I think the way that it's managed is through community, what's happening there is people are kind of living in webs of community where they're accountable. If you're living with your family and your friends, and say you're like a psychopath or someone, who kind of wants to cause harm, is only interested in yourself. In that situation, there's kind of limits on how much harm you can do, really, like just through the level of day-to-day accountability. Like if you're getting easily upset about things, kind of within a single day, presumably someone's going to have a conversation with you and be like, "What's going on? How do we make sure this doesn't get out of control?" Effectively, it's a really natural thing humans do, and so I think that's the solution. Is that human society really is healthy human society is always based around community, and community involves us spending a lot of our time dealing with each other, socializing with each other, and so it's so different to our conception now, where we think of ourselves as these atomized people who, if we want to live in isolation and never see anyone, we should have that right. It's such a different picture that you might think, well, it sounds like a lot of work, but actually, what spending time with friends and talking to people is some of the most effortless. We're really built for it. It's not something that would be labor, I think. So then, how do we get there? Like if we, and I think the way to do it is just to advocate for people. Kind of, we see this even just on trivial or commonplace sentiments around kind of escaping the rat race. People realizing, and you go back to the 50s, I don't think that was really a sentiment. People really were in this psychological model of, I have to, buy the new thing, chase the thing, and then eventually I'll be happy. And then a generation realized they weren't happy. And then so this kind of meme spreads around. And I think that's part of the process, is people realizing the good life consists of having enough, having relationship, these things that are free, that, we think of as the best things in life. So I think a kind of a general kind of bottom-up cultural move in that direction would be the answer. And that's the kind of process. What would then happen? Say you have, say something really radical happens and you start getting huge communities of people living sustainably close to nature, and they're doing kind of psychedelic therapy with each other, and it's this kind of, hippie paradise situation. If that became like geopolitically significant, I think you're right that it would only take one Putin or one person who's ossified in their egoic, aggressive psychology to threaten them with nukes or whatever, and then game over. Like the world's not; those people are not. They spend their lives consolidating power to make themselves feel protected. So by definition, they have power. The hippies are not. Like, I'm not going to spend my life. You think of the amount of day in, day out work someone like Putin had to do to get to that position of power. I'm not going to do that, because that's not where my psychology is. So I'm never going to have the ability to kind of force people, and I don't think it's wise to force people to do things. So fundamentally, I think that the thing you described of like, how do we bring these people around? How do we stop them blocking a better world? Because they probably, I think accountability actually they would see that probably as terrifying. They don't want to, because a lot of the time I think narcissism is based in, when it is based in trauma, it's based in a kind of wounding where you really think other people aren't safe. No one really has your best interest at heart. Everyone's going to judge you. Everyone's going to think you're terrible. So the sense of being held accountable would be overwhelming for them. Whereas, I think when people have a sense of this spiritual view, you could say, but to me it's also just a naturalistic view, where you look and you say humans are not the approximate cause of their behavior, but they're the ultimate cause. If I do something wrong, there's always a causal story that's led to me doing that at that point. So there is no, if I'm being held accountable, it's purely a pragmatic measure to make sure harm doesn't happen. I don't have to think, oh no, they hate James. James's ego, like his essence is bad. They're saying and we don't have to believe that about others. We have to say, like, I think you are a bad person in your core. What's really, because that just doesn't mean anything really. What's happened is circumstances, whether it's genetics and environment, has led people to cause harm. And so in a healthy, grounded society, people I think they'd feel okay being held accountable, because it's the flip side of community. But anyway, the point is that I can imagine there just being this fundamental roadblock, that there's been so much consolidation of power that those personality types are basically gonna win. Like, they have the controls and their game may win, and their game is the game we're currently playing that takes us off a cliff when it comes to human civilization. And I just don't see again, the naturalist in me doesn't see it as a foregone conclusion that we can fix this. We could just be in a game structure where they win by the logic of the game. But again, it's not actually an all or nothing thing. If you can make this happen in your own life, if you can make yourself feel more free from structures that control you, and you can feel value through being connected to people, then you're doing the good work. That's, to me, that's what life's about, and you're spreading that to make it more of a reality as a whole. Hopefully, we can get to a place where it gets some kind of critical mass, but it's not a full conclusion.
Well, and I think we can take a full revolution into what you started with the living mirrors theory of consciousness, and this really wasn't introduced in this conversation, but could be found in your actual video describing the living mirrors theory of consciousness, when single-celled organisms are in the ocean near the floor, and there's a vent, and it's transmitting kinetic energy and heat and so forth. That certain cells will not respond to that, and they'll perish, and other cells will, in that classic adaptation sense, will figure that out, or they'll have some not necessarily figure it out, but they will react to that. And I think it's all iterative in this sense that we've come to this point where we do have these vents, these threats that are coming up to this much more sophisticated system of human psychosocial being. And I like to think that we're socially stigmergic creatures, and that we tend to move in these consensual formations, these non-linear, these non-top-down organized things. And so that gives me some hope that if we feel enough pain and we feel enough of that kinetic energy coming, like in present times, and we have this situation in Ukraine, which is horrific, and it's certainly not the only thing that's happened recently. This is where I would like to get a little bit culturally sensitive and say this happens a lot, but it's happening in Europe right now, and so it's becoming more salient to people in the West. But it's horrific, and that which happened in Syria is horrific, and in Chechnya and Georgia, with Putin, and so all of these things I think put us in a very vulnerable space. And I think if enough people feel that sense of instability and vulnerability, that they will seek a means to remedy the situation. I don't know. I mean, we had World War I and World War II, and we had the Cold War, and we've had all these little skirmishes, and has change occurred? I don't know. What's the ratio of the harm versus the learning that we've had from it? But the stakes are so high. We could be one mood away from nuclear annihilation, or a bad mood move or something. So I don't know. That's another thing I'm agnostic to. I mean, we could all just get vaporized. But one thing, if we don't irradiate the planet, if our civilization collapses, there are uncontacted people in the Amazon, there are people in New Guinea and in Africa who will move along just fine. And so the species, I think, as long as, again, we don't irradiate the planet, I think the species will be okay. Right. I don't know if what we did and what our folly was will become like an Atlantean legend where, there was this society.
I was having that thought yesterday, actually. Yeah.
Utopian society that just did itself in and here's a question. You're a neuroscientist. I mean, has our intelligence become maladaptive at this point? I mean, were we at a sweet spot where we were primitive proto-agricultural pre-pottery kind of people, and we just, we got into this sideline?
Yeah, that's a great point. Because I guess with human history, I think, what happened is that it's partly our intelligence, but perhaps even more significant, there's a certain level of intelligence you need to communicate and coordinate, and thereby kind of have culture. But it's our the pure coincidence that, you can get dolphins that are smart, but they don't have the thumbs that we have. But because we evolved on a lineage that picked kind of fruit in trees, we have these opposable thumbs, and we can build technology. And suddenly, I think that is if you think of these two aspects to the mind of the kind of the grounded, reflexive, kind of almost plant-like consciousness that's just feeling its way through the world and feels at peace, versus the egoic, control, problem-solving mind. When you're living in a world where there are stone axes and agricultural techniques and you can control nature, I just think that that's so seductive to the problem-solving part of our minds that we just went in this exponential kind of rush down that. We just tipped down that route. So I think you're right. The intelligence paired with our ability to manipulate the world. Again, this steps into what I was referring to as absurdism of kind of just the unfolding of nature. That things happen. Like nature doesn't really know where it's going. It stumbles into certain games and certain patterns, and they can self-destruct. They can, like, weird things can happen. I think we're in a weird moment in the evolution of the natural world, and my instinct is that it's it seems to be moving in a direction that's not sustainable, and we see from every other civilization that's exists in history that collapses, that it builds itself up and then it collapses. I do, that's the picture I tend to have, but I'm also not ruling out that we're not on the verge of some huge breakthrough into getting off planet, in the same way that fish came out of the sea, and if I would have been one of those fish underwater being like, he's an idiot trying to get on land, it's never going to work. And then suddenly, oh wait a minute, is he breathing on land? Like, that's crazy.
How do you do that?
So I hold open the possibility that could happen, but my instinct is that we need to turn away from the skies and back into the earth and become more grounded.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a social evolutionary step that would be most beneficial. So just have to see if we can if we can tamp down the psychic injury, and I say psychic in the psychological sense.
Right.
There again is an iterative pattern that it's sort of introjected into the children, and I think that's sort of the wellspring of our despair in one aspect of that despair that we bring to ourselves. But I think it comes from I think solutions come from, again, work like you're doing and a lot of other people are doing, to look to the past as well as look at where we are now, and start thinking future forward, not in the technotopian escapist kind of thing where they promise everlasting life and resurrection in a computer, or you get to jettison off to Mars with all the other billionaires and you get to wave, which I think is so untenable because Mars just doesn't have the gravity or any of the systems that would allow us to flourish. So, hopefully we'll find habitable planets elsewhere, but then are we this sort of parasitic creature? What's the ethical implications there? So,
if we just take our plundering psychology with us and we just go around mining everything, is that good?
Yeah. No, I think I'm with you that we need to hit pause, reassess, and evaluate what is essential. And I think that's where spirituality comes in. And like you, I had Catholicism foist on me, and I realized that when I had to get high to go to church, that I was not into the process. And so when I think I was like 14 or 15, and my mother's, why aren't you? Yeah, are you going to church? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to church. So I just whatever. I didn't want anything to do with it. So I think I've come around a lot though in my life, and I love Christian mysticism. I love Islamic Sufi mysticism. I love a lot of those stories, and I think baked into those stories are things like we've talked about. So, shedding the identity, shedding the selfness for a while, whether it's on a DMT trip or whether it's a really deep, because I've had good deep meditations where I've got to not be me for a while, and it's just glorious. And I have not had breakthrough DMT trips, but I've had LSD trips where it's all bets are off and you're gone, So I can appreciate that, but I'm all for looking at reformation within religion. You had, who was it, John Butler on your show, and he speaks to me as a sort of non-dual Christian. There's Francis Connolly, I think, and Richard Rohr and Thomas Merton, all these really amazing people who are very much embedded in systems of in that case, Catholicism, that can speak to that sort of moving beyond the dogma, moving beyond the subjugation of people just again by blind faith. And I
definitely have weirdly come around to like spiritual wisdom within Christianity after maybe having a couple of decades passed since my kind of confrontation with it is what it took, but because it's also not really taught as a spiritual tradition, it's taught as a kind of hierarchical system to be part of, that you have to believe dogmatic beliefs. At least that was my experience. And recently I've been kind of remembering that as a kid, there were the bits that I was taught about that were not neat, like, because you're told this very neat story of good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell, and it's very easy to get your head around. Good stuff is good, bad stuff is bad. Instead of and when I first saw kind of Hindu deities that like of destruction and things like that, I was like, what's this? Like a sense of inclusiveness of reality, of all aspects of reality was really confusing to me. And I remember having that stories of like when Jesus gets angry and turns, the tables and the money lenders, and then when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane before he's killed, and he's like doubting this, he's trying to bargain his way out of it with God, and all of this stuff. I remember reading as a kid, and it made me feel really unsettled. I was like, why is there messiness in this? And it just didn't feel right. And then now as an adult, you live life, and I actually have found, even things like doubting Thomas and stuff like that sometimes come to mind as like, oh, like there's some good stuff in here. Like some of it's kind of good to live by. Like the figure of Jesus in general was kind of useful. But yeah, it's I saw philosopher Philip Goff was playing around recently with some kind of secular Christianity stuff, and maybe being in England, if that seems more plausible. But I imagine in America, it feels so entrenched with the kind of the form of Christianity that I don't see much. Once you say you're Christian, I think it maps onto a certain thing. The idea of a naturalistic, secular, spiritual Christianity, I wouldn't imagine having. But yeah, as you mentioned, Richard Rohr and people are amazing, so maybe it will catch on.
Yeah, and again, I think, and you touched on this when dealing with psychopathy and dark vulnerable triad people, that there will be this pressure. And again, I love the social stigmergy metaphor that, if it becomes unfashionable to be a fundamentalist who only sees the negative, I like to look at it, there's the X theory of management and Y theory of management. X is coercion, Y is reward, kind of to really coarse grain it. But, if you can convert that, hellfire and brimstone kind of talking to, encouraging your flock. And this is why I love the idea of Reformation, is they already have the attention of hundreds of millions. The Catholic Church has the attention of a billion people. And if a few, and I have to give Francis, the current Pope, some credit. He's a reformer in a sense, and he's culturally and socially a little more awakened than his predecessors. Little things like that, you already have a built-in audience. And I know we're getting close to probably where I should let you go, but Jamie Wheel talked about ethical culting and culting, and how do we build ethical culting, which is just cultus or cultural organization. And so I see these systems of Islam and Judaism and Christianity, and not so much the Eastern traditions, because they're doing their own thing, but that it's already got an audience built in. And if some things can change there, even, I'm all about percentages, right? Like when it comes to diet,
Right.
like I'm not a vegan, but I eat probably 80 to 90% plant, and so that's me,
Right.
but I'm not a dogmatic, meat eater or vegetarian or anything like that. But so if faith can be seen in that way, that if the fathers and the clerics and the pastors and all of that would see the power they hold for good and for change and for transformation. And again, the Richard Rohr types and the Thomas Merton types and John Butler, right. If folks like that could step up and just say, this is probably more what was in alignment with what Christ
right.
was teaching, or the Christ consciousness that they talk about, which I'm comfortable with, because it's just
right.
for me. That it's compassion, it's empathy, it's support, it's all these things that we should aspire to. So
yeah, no, I hear you. We just have to spike this holy water with LSD, I guess.
Yeah, that's my dad.
Not actually advocating that.
No. And my dad told me when I was a teenager, he goes, I grew up in suburban Maryland outside of Washington, D.C., and there was a place called the Tridelphia Reservoir. And it was the water supply for all of Washington, D.C. Oh, wow. And my old man was kind of a hippie dude. He went to Vietnam and he smoked a lot of grass. But he said they were going to drop a couple grams of LSD into into the water system and just dose everybody. So I think a lot of hippies in the 60s were like, man, if we could just turn on 150,000, right. 200,000 people, it would be horrifying for a lot. And hopefully it got metered down to like 200 or 300 micrograms per person, so you don't like really.
Yeah, the problem with that, there are many problems with that, but you definitely can't dose it well unless you have the map of, I don't know how right. much water there is.
One neighborhood would get 5,000 micrograms, exactly, the other 50 micrograms. Yeah, it wouldn't work out, but they were joking. I probably just a fleeting thought, but
it was definitely a meme right in the 60s, I think, like dose the water supply.
Yeah, just get everybody turned on. And I don't like that in the sense that you're violating consent, right. Because I've had drugs slipped on me before.
Oh, wow.
I've got a good PCP story, since you appreciate ketamine and psychedelics. when I was in high school, I smoked, I got high with some friends in a car, and it tasted like shit. I was smoking away, and I thought, this was the mid 80s. So it was still when Mexican brown weed was more popular than anything. And I was like, I better smoke a lot of this because this tastes
Oh,
terrible.
wow.
Yeah, it's like really bad weed. I want to get high before I go to school. I got out of the car and I looked at my friend, and my friend was like, I'm fucking high, man. And I said, yeah, me too. And I started looking, and everything started to shrink. And I was like, oh God, I realized what had happened. The kids that we were smoking with were smoking PCP. And I thought, I did a really hero's dose of PCP and without knowing it. And they didn't say anything. And I thought that was a little unethical of them, but whatever.
Yeah,
we were just kids, right? 16. So here's the funny thing. I get into school. I managed to fit into the tiny school that had shrunk. I was going down the hallway, and I did my first exteriorization. I was actually ahead of my body, and I looked back at my body. I said, very matter of factly, I was like, come on, we're already late for class. Let's go. So this is where I was. And I got into class, and highest I've ever been, without like serotonergic type drugs like LSD or DMT. I sat myself down in my chair, and the teacher had announced a quiz for that day. So I got there just in time to start this quiz. And so my body was doing the quiz. Well, I kept exteriorizing. I kept going up, and I would see everybody's head over the classroom. And I saw me down there taking the quiz. And I'm not advocating, I don't believe in souls or anything like that. So, but just that who was it? Michael Shermer had a guest on one time, and they were talking about, there is a scientific explanation to, like, people early in the 50s, they were using ketamine and PCP, and people were exteriorizing in the operating room. And they did have some seemingly plausible explanation for why your sense of vision is all of a sudden like 5 meters away from your body or whatever. So, but that was fascinating. That was the one psychedelic trip that I could share with you that was beyond. I've had the good classic LSD where a lot, everything goes crazy, but the leaving my body was fascinating, and experiencing myself outside of me.
Yeah, it's definitely a real psychological phenomenon, that experience. And there's Susan Blakemore, who had that kind of experience, and then was a paranormal researcher, and then gradually became kind of secular and scientific. And I mean, she was doing science before, but and then went from having an extraordinary out-body experience and believing it 100%, there was some kind of soul astral projection, to thinking it's a brain phenomenon. So yeah, her work's interesting on that. People have done stuff, and when people are undergoing surgery and they have these experiences, they put like text on top of bookshelves to see, like, if you really are, if it's more than imaginative projection, then you should be able to report those back. And there haven't been any, positive results there, I think. But yeah, I mean, it also, it kind of brings us full circle to the idea of consciousness as an interface with the world. Like, as I'm looking at the world right now, it feels like it's just given, and I'm effortlessly looking out of it through my kind of transparent eyeballs. But actually, it's a construction. My eyeballs are they don't let light through, into my brain. Right? There's a kind of my brain's completely in the pitch black, and so it's all just me here. And then there's this conjuring of an interface of of this world. And so the idea that I can mentally project myself and imagine what it would look like from above. Any good, if you imagine you had a 3D animation, like simulation on a computer, you'd totally be able to drag around the viewpoint and see it from different places. So your brain's conjuring this room, it should totally be able to imaginatively move around. It should feel as real. But yeah, I can totally imagine that being a really fascinating way to explore the mind that I've not really had.
Yeah. Fortunately, I was a hardhead at the time, and I had done, I was experienced with drug taking. And so I was very close to calling the hospital, or an ambulance or something, because it was out of control for about an hour. But I managed to just I couldn't ground myself because I kept leaving, I kept doing this weird thing, but I managed to, and the next period class, I actually got a B on that quiz, by the way. The next period, I had a friend, and she had done PCP regularly. And so I just had her, I said, I'm dosed up right now. And I said, I'm pretty much back to normal, but I want you just to keep an eye on me for about a half an hour, 40 minutes for this class. And she's like, yeah, sure, whatever. You're fine. Just sit next to me. So I had a babysitter for the lesser impactful. But yeah, it's fascinating how, and I like what you're saying, because I think perceptually, when we walk in a room and there's a shelf full of books, your brain already picks up every title, it knows everything there, and you just can't access it, but it
doesn't think that, your brain doesn't think it's when it gets to the top of the bookshelf, say it's all kind of made of pine, you don't think there's a void at the top. If you were to say, imagine what it looks like from the top, no, you assume there's like a panel of pine the same as there are on the other shells, right? So you can imaginatively rotate it, but the outer body, people who think it's supernatural almost seem to assume that what's out of sight is literally out of mind. That like if I'm not currently looking down on top of your head, who knows, maybe there's a clown's face on the back of your head, or whereas actually, as I rotate my head, you already have this model that knows what it's expecting, right? Brain's all about kind of prediction. But yeah, on the we were joking about the kind of the dosing stuff and that sentiment in the 60s of if we had a critical mass of if everyone was just turned on with LSD, then everything would get that positive change. I think there's a sense there of like assuming it's almost in the LSD, like if you just take it, it will give you the result you want. This kind of brings us back to the grounding thing before, where it's a similar sentiment with me, where I'm excited about psychedelic renaissance, but what I'm excited about is thousands, tens of thousands of people being in safe settings with psychotherapeutic support and coming to feel grounded. And the psychedelics are really just catalyst to bring them into these very real experiences of connecting with the world. And I'm also, I'm not just into the medical model. I think, it's insane that people are not allowed to grow these things, grow mushrooms in their closet and take them. That should absolutely not be criminalized. And if we can have safe community, like I'd love to see community centers popping up where people help each other with growing these and then guide each other, but all based around why is practice, harm reduction, helping people feel safe and grounded. And that's the thing that I think, if anything's going to shift the needle on society as a whole, I think that's the best bet we have.
Well, it seems like it has become very prevalent in pop experience or pop social structure. I don't want to say pop culture, but it's more that it's on our minds. You see it a lot in popular literature and things like that. It's talked about on YouTube. So if it's handled responsibly, I advocate that, because I live in Florida, and when I first arrived here, I was 21 years old. So again, I was still very much interested in getting high and doing things. And so I went immediately to all the cow pastures, and I actually brought the cow manure back to the house and grew my own mushrooms. But I did it at that stage of my life. I called it the empathic response, and taking just a meso dose, not a breakthrough and not a micro dose, but just a medium dose where shades of color start changing and vibrancy is a little different. And of course you get the hilarity sometimes, but it also got me in touch with my empathic self. And I was born an empath. As a child, I was an empath, but one of my parents was kind of a, what do they call it? A covert narcissist, kind of like very manipulative. Right. And I was leaning more into sociopathy as a teenager. I was very unfeeling, uncaring, and could not necessarily be violent, but just had a lot of bad thoughts. And so I brought myself back a little bit more into an empathic frame of mind or system or whatever, just by taking maybe a gram or two of mushrooms and just having an evening where I just kind of get in touch with myself, and I feel it was almost like I had to make myself feel again and feel connected to those emotions again. So I advocate that.
It's amazing that when it comes the empathic connection, the feeling of wanting to connect to other people and wanting to trust them and figuring out how to do that is more fundamental than the feeling of separation and hostility. Because if you think of us as these social primates, we're almost, again, the group is almost like a multicellular organism that we're cells in who are coupled to each other. And so if you're gonna loosen your beliefs with the psychedelic and then see what direction you drift in, very few people, anecdotally, I don't see people shifting in the direction of, what would be great is if I hurt people more and I felt more separate from them. People tend to be, they have these empathic responses, almost out of an evolved geometric relationship between us being part of this group. And so I think that's good news that people can drift in that kind of direction with this work.
Yeah, I don't see there being any sort of negative valence or negative affect or anything like that with psychedelics, because like you said, I have enough experience with them that if I did have a negative thought, it wouldn't go to a good place. Like, thinking about harming somebody or getting revenge on somebody or manipulating somebody in a bad way. I've had those introspective moments where I felt terrible about insignificant things. So I can't imagine. And again, I'm empathic by nature, but I can think of somebody who might be sociopathic, that would be amplified, and that there may be. And in fact, I've read people's reports who say, I realized what an asshole I was, and how manipulative I was, and how, dangerous I could be, and things like that. So yeah, I think it seems to have a one direction orientation in terms of bringing awareness of our obfuscated character or personality to ourselves.
And I think as well, if people learn how to have techniques to reduce stress physiologically in their body, there are these kind of interesting tremoring techniques that I found very valuable. That just kind of moves you into a state of openness and surrender, and releasing of stress and breathing, all of this stuff. I feel like when people have a difficult time, it's when they haven't explored how to release the stress. So they have a thought that scares them, and then they tense up, and they feel like there's really nowhere to run. So they struggle with it, and then they're having a bad time, and it's nothing really good is happening. Whereas if you have a thought, no matter what it is, no matter, in the privacy of your own mind, you can think anything. It could be absolutely shocking to you, but then the moment later you stay with it, as long as you've learned how to be in a mode where, I would experience this as maybe I would start tremoring, but then my breathing would relax, and then you would see what's behind that thought. Maybe it's hurt, maybe it's resentment, whatever it is. And there's this kind of always stepping back and seeing what's behind that, and there's always a kind of causal story that leads you back into, and then it always leads to the same place. You're always back here in the present moment. And also, I genuinely think that because like any living system that preferred discord wouldn't really survive, if it wanted disorder. So I think there's actually a built-in, I mentioned earlier how some people, when you get very quiet, you can notice there's a kind of feeling of love or benevolence, it's attested to in different spiritual traditions. And I think that's a property of being a living system, that we all actually in our deep kind of biophysical core want the best, like we all really want flourishing deep down. Mm-hmm. And the covert narcissists of the world, and all of the people who cause harm, I feel like, and even if you take someone who's really like causes, goes around like hurting people physically, I feel like if we say like you are bad and that's the end of the story, I feel like there's this sense from their perspective of, no, I misunderstood, like screw you, because like if you live my life, if you knew how I got to this point, like how dare you kind of judge me? So there's a sense of not being seen, and of a kind of, I think, an empowering resentment that people of these kind of dark personalities feel, and they don't think they're in the wrong. They feel like there's a reason they are that way. So I think for them, what that says is actually, if they had the right circumstances, I think that even they would want to live in a situation of flourishing and of peace. So when you surrender to whatever's arising in your mind and you trace it back, that's what you come down to. You discover an inherent wholesomeness, an inherent goodness, and just a sense of peace and of just being, which is wonderful. So it's the thing we all want, is happiness. It's, and so that's the great thing about doing this work, is you can be scared by stuff on the way, but you'll come back to a really positive core. It gives me a sense of, I understand now why people talk about things like souls, because it's astounding when you first realize that your true nature has this lovely kind of wholesome quality. It feels, I don't believe in anything extra that's added to the organism, like a soul. But I see why people come up with words like that, because it's good news that it's down there, these qualities.
Absolutely. We've reached that hour and a half point that we had talked about, but I do have two quickish kind of questions that maybe we could finish out with, and then you're fully invited to come back. There's an open invitation.
That'd be great.
Yeah, I'd like that. So the first question is, being familiar with both meditation and psychedelics, have you reached in meditation a not necessarily equivalent, but a space where the sense of self does dissolve, and you do have a very sort of watered down kind of unitive experience? Have you experienced that in your own practice to any degree?
So I tend to be a bit shy talking about
okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm very happy to, but
okay.
I notice in myself a sense of because I guess the person in me who's kind of the secular scientist person, when people go around making extraordinary claims about their subjective experience that they can't really prove, I guess it triggers in me a sense of like, don't be that guy who's like, it comes across as like a kind of huckster or something, I guess, just making unprovable claims. But so when I had that experience as teenagers is what people typically call kind of an awakening experience, where you have this full blown. It's very similar to, you read the work like Eckhart Tolle and people, this like full blown like loss of self and a feeling of being in the world, and an ability to toggle into that never really left. I can right now I can kind of toggle between a sense of selflessness and just the world being fully present, and that's it. And then toggle back into kind of a sense of, okay, I'm here and I can navigate the world. So it's a very deep, profound experience that it really feels, it came very fully formed. And then to me, the practice was always in terms of taking the sense of the separate self with its neuroses and its habits and stuff, and trying to bring that more into alignment with this other way of viewing. Mm-hmm. And so the thing I'm describing is well attested, non-dual traditions in meditation, where they basically point out that the mind is already kind of enlightened. It's not something you create or you generate. It's something you can notice and tap into. So yeah, the reason I say I'm shy is because then it sounds like you're throwing around words like enlightened and stuff. And I really don't think it's good to think of people as being like enlightened as a kind of story. I think there's always everyone's always in process, and there's this truth you can notice and you can connect to and you can live out of that. But I really don't think anyone's been like this image we have of someone who just like fully never for the rest of their lives did any thoughts arise or anything like that. A sense of self is extinguished fully. I think that's a bit of a fantasy. So it's I was looking, someone recommended me today the work of someone who had a similar experience, and she's a researcher trying to kind of normalize talk around this stuff, because she had a similar experience to me of feeling quite embarrassed to talk about it, because it's all of this, there were these pitfalls of talking about it. It sounds kind of odd and like you're claiming you're special or something. Mm-hmm. And she's trying to kind of normalize it. And I would like to see that people can, because in like Buddhist traditions, there's this talk of Buddha nature, which they say every living being has, which is just this awake consciousness, just a description of this, peaceful, already wide awake nature of mind. So it's not something extraordinary. Well, it feels extraordinary at first, but it's also very ordinary. It's just what's at the bottom of your mind. And it's something everyone has, so everyone can tap into it. And the more people feel they recognize this and can live from it, I think the better.
Yeah, I think the term enlightenment has the same vulnerability as some of the other desires for transcendence and things like that, and it can become rewound into egoic presentation. And I call those enlightenment traps. Where you think you're spiritually woke, and maybe you did, you went through something, but I think a sign of someone who had an awakening experience is humility and keeping it. I'm not going to talk about it because it's not important. What's important is I am a good, conduit for perhaps what that is, but not verbally and not in action.
Right, and that's extremely well said, because the thing is, the conduit, the person you're talking to now, like you're always talking to James. You're always talking to the separate self, So James never is like enlightened or anything like that. There's an aspect of the mind that we might want to use that word for, that you can rest into, just this wide awake nature that's there. But then that doesn't mean that the conduit, the person who wants to then relay that message, is an enlightened person, right? Like you're always going to deal with all of my messiness as a psychological being. Like, so it really, I almost want to minimize like what it means to have these experiences, in a sense that like it's almost like just noticing something about yourself, but it really doesn't imply much about how. I mean, by waking up to the ground of what's going on in your experience, it shows you the wise direction to move in. So those kinds of people you would hope would then try to, as you say, live in a way that's less egoic and live in a way that's more ethical. But that's work that involves deconditioning stuff that already exists in their body and their brain, and there's no guarantee that will happen. There are lots of very spiritually actualized people who've abused people en masse. So that was well said.
Yeah, I think you've cautioned in some of your talks, whether they're monologues or interviews, about the pitfalls of the guru phenomena. And I have this theory of my own, and it's it's the theory that's already out there. It's nothing I came up with, but it's that, we live vicariously through other people and the archetypes of other people. And so we live through the guru, we live through the enlightened,
right,
spiritually awakened person, because we want that for ourselves. And if we can just adore this person enough, or follow them, or commit to them enough, or devotional, or whatever, that we'll get there. And I think that's again another trap that can lead nowhere, or lead to abuse, as you've said. And I know you speak to, there's been Buddhist teachers and all kinds of people, so spiritual guru types that they fall off of that original intent, which was to be supportive and helping with transformation. So yeah, it's and again, that goes back to, and this can be another conversation for another time, is ethical cultural engagement and communitas, as they say over on Rebel Wisdom, the Schmachtenberger types, that are trying to really figure this out. And how do we do a grounded, ethically informed circling or community conversations and behavior and so forth. So, but that's another conversation. So my second finish out question would be, what are your thoughts on tech with regard to technology and virtual reality and even perhaps augmented reality as a say another means beyond meditation and psychedelics, having a useful utility? And I have this computer back here is for virtual reality, and I haven't been using it lately, but I think it's amazing how it does hijack your senses. And I think if you get the right clever code writers and people, Imagineers, as Disney calls them, people that can come together with a program or a system that might help facilitate some of these breakthroughs as well. And on top of that, being a safe and entertaining means to release psychic trauma, or to just find that enlightened nature. So what are your thoughts on the future of VR and things like that?
Yeah, so I've got friends who work in kind of neuroscience with VR as like kind of doing human brain imaging while people explore landscapes with VR. And so they're doing very cool work and kind of well-being in cities and navigation and cool stuff like that. And I think there's a whole range of interesting applications. When it comes, I mean, my bias personally is I feel the sense that through stepping away from complexity and from problem solving and technology and all of that stuff, and into direct experience and just feeling as grounded as possible, without the artificiality of VR concerns me, I guess, in terms of it's being in nature and just being present is the medicine, really. It's the thing that really does the good work. And so I have a kind of, my personal bias is to emphasize where technology is not necessary. So take something like neurofeedback for meditation, could be really useful. People have scan their measure brain activity, get a sound, tell you how you're doing, could be useful, but it's kind of like training wheels in the sense that you need to really eventually learn to do these things by yourself to really integrate it. You don't want to be walking with crutches if you're your whole life, to mix my metaphors. So yeah, that's my general bias, but I do think there's interesting stuff going on. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done.
Yeah, and so I'll share one thing I found exciting from a couple of years ago. There's a woman named Judith Amores, and it may be a hyphenated name. There may be a third name, and I apologize, but I remember Judith Amores. And she got her PhD at MIT working with virtual reality systems and the real nuts and bolts of it, not just the visual. But anyway, one of the systems she came up with was EEG related interaction, where she could simulate psychokinesis, and she could simulate all these different weird things that just by hands off, just thinking, you can manipulate stuff. And so she figured out a way to use brainwaves to be part of that VR system. And I just offer that as an interesting sort of peek into what people are trying to do. What you do with that, I don't know, but I just throw that up there as an interesting side note.
And I mentioned earlier the kind of neuroscience work that Anil Seth's doing, and he works with like VR, and so you've got your brain's, the idea is your brain's building up predictions, and then if those predictions are violated, there should be some prediction error signal, and so you can have things where you expect things to move a certain way and they don't respond the way you think they do. You can change the physics. I think that stuff's very cool when it comes to just kind of unpicking the neuroscience of consciousness.
And I agree with you that it shouldn't be a primary means to doing therapeutic work, but I also would offer that I'm in my 50s, so I can't relate with this at all, but I'd say people under 30 were raised with technology and machines a
Right.
lot more than I was. I mean, we had pocket calculators in the 70s, and that was about it. But anyway, they are already predisposed to this sort of familiarity and this openness to what so in other words, gamers and people who are constantly, you know, looking at their iPhones or whatever. I would almost think that that's a first segue for them to be enticed by the allure of this thing, and just putting on a VR headset and just beginning that process, and then maybe triggering some curiosity, and then seeking more holistic or grounded or natural means, whether that again is plant medicine or meditation. That would be great. But so yeah, I'm almost advocating for the young ones who there's a lot of dark side and shadow side to that. But I think, you know, if they can be that comfortable with technology, that maybe slipping on a hood and just beginning the process of whatever it is they need to do.
Kind of gateway experience.
Yeah, exactly. Get them. They're already primed for their relationship with the machine, so that they would trust that system, and then hopefully they would be curious, and then hopefully, again, just like a good sitter or somebody who's working in psychedelic therapy, that you can say, well, okay, yeah, this is just, you know, one means and one aspect of this whole thing. Let's go work on meditation now and doing breath work and you know, body part awareness and things like that, and help them. And I know there are meditation apps in VR already, and they're real ground floor. They're you know, anyway. So I hold out a little hope for that. I hope, and that's one of the reasons I bought a VR system, is I'm curious, because if I ever had the funds, I would love to help be a benefactor to somebody who can put something together that just triggers something for people. It might be the beginning for a journey to move forward and to grow. And
I saw a paper, I can't remember, it was from coming out the other week, on someone trying to do psychedelic experiences in VR that looked really interesting. So there's definitely cool stuff going on in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And also simulating like like NDE or psychedelic, you know, kind of peak experience stuff, but not to the degree of really being there, but just giving an introductory, you know, this is kind of what's going to happen, because it really does take it captures vision, it captures audio, and to some degree it's capturing tactile senses and things like that. They're developing things that interact with your musculature and things like that. So I mean, it's where they're going. You know, hopefully it's not all just for frivolity, that some of that can have therapeutic value. We'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see what they do. Yeah. Well, James, it's been an amazing conversation, and I intuited that it would be, not in a supernatural sense, but I just had a feeling that this would be a really fun and productive conversation, and it was. And I thank you for that. It was good experience. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the YouTubers who are still watching, I offer my gratitude to you as well for sticking out all the way to the end of this conversation. I see about 10% of my audience stays to the end, and so I acknowledge you guys, and thank you very much for sticking it out, because James is an amazing person, and like I said, everything that you need to find and discover him, if you haven't already, will be down below. So James, I'll say goodbye to you after we stop record, and I'll say thank you and goodbye again to the YouTube audience. I appreciate your support. So all right, James, again, it was a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.